Growing vertically in a small garden requires careful planning to avoid shading out other plants and hindering their growth. Today I'll share 6 easy tips that we follow to optimize vertical growing while allowing other plants to get the sun they need. The first step is to place your trellises on the north side of garden beds. This prevents vertical crops from shading out other plants in the same bed. For example, here we're growing indeterminate tomatoes vertically on the north side of these beds, with lettuce and kale in front of 2 trellises and zucchini in front of another. As the sun arcs through the sky from east to west, the tomatoes will cast a shadow to the north, and the lettuce, kale, zucchini, and tomatoes will all receive full sun. This brings us to our second tip. As a rule, arrange plants from shortest to tallest, with the tallest being in the back or north side of the bed. This prevents plants in the front from shading out plants in the back. For example, we have lettuce in the front of this bed, then dinosaur kale, and then tomatoes. Each plant is taller than the next, which ensures they all get plenty of sun. When the lettuce bolts this summer, we'll replace it with another relatively short crop, but one that tolerates the summer heat, like Swiss chard. Likewise, the zucchini we planted in front of these tomatoes will enjoy full sun and won't shade out the much taller tomatoes. Tip number 3 is to use trellises that don't cast much of a shadow. Early in the growing season, before vertical crops take off, I want plants behind the trellises, like this garlic, to benefit from full sun. Here you can see the shadow cast by one of our conduit remesh trellises on the walking path behind it. You can make out the shadow of the conduit frame, but the remesh grid barely casts a shadow at all. This ensures that plants behind the trellis get full sun this time of year. Of course, when our trellises are loaded up with tomatoes, cucumbers, winter squash, and pole beans, they will cast a shadow. So it's important to think about how closely we plant crops behind a trellis. This brings us to tip number 4. Plant sun-loving crops far enough away from the trellis to avoid shading. Here we have garlic planted behind tomatoes, which will eventually grow to the top of the 8-foot trellises. Let's see if the tomatoes will ever shade out the garlic. To find out, I reached to the top of a trellis and recorded where the shadow of my hand fell. The beds are separated by an 18-inch walking path, and it's a little over 2 feet from the trellis to the garlic. In late May at 10:30 a.m., the shadow just barely touched the front of the next raised bed. At noon, the shadow fell a few inches into the next raised bed. So will the tomatoes ever shade out the garlic? Probably not. Our tomatoes typically reach the top of the trellis in late July, and we harvest our garlic before then in early July. And at the time of the garlic harvest, the sun will be near its highest point in the sky, and vertical crops will be casting less of a shadow. So garlic was an excellent choice to plant just 2 feet away from the tomatoes, but it would not have been a good idea to plant peppers here, because the tomatoes will eventually shade out the front of this bed as the sun lowers in the sky in late summer. I prefer to plant long-season sun-loving crops like peppers, at least 4 feet behind tomatoes. This brings us to tip number 5, which is to plant shade-tolerant crops behind vertical crops. Here we have tree collards about 2 feet behind a trellis where we'll grow cucumbers and scarlet runner beans. This is the perfect distance to ensure the collards get full sun during the spring and early summer, and partial shade in late summer. Likewise, when we harvest garlic in July, we'll replace it with crops that do well in partial shade, like lettuce, Swiss chard, or beets. And now for our final tip. Intentionally plant cool weather, early season crops like lettuce directly behind vertical summer crops to take advantage of the shade provided in summer. Here we have lettuce planted directly behind tomatoes. It was planted weeks before the tomatoes were transplanted and has enjoyed full sun the entire time. However, as we move into summer, the tomatoes will begin to provide midday shade for the lettuce, which could delay when the lettuce bolts. This is a great way to turn a perceived disadvantage into an advantage. Well, that's the last of today's tips, but I thought I'd take time to answer a related question. In response to last week's video, a number of you asked if our new trellis shelves will shade out other plants. Let's take a look and see. At 10:30 a.m. in late May, the shadow of the trellis shelf hits the walking path. At noon, it's still mostly in the walking path, but also falls on the back edge of the raised bed. So at the moment, our trellis shelves are not shading out other crops, and I don't expect they will between now and July when we remove the pots to make way for the watermelons and winter squash, which will hopefully climb to the top of these trellises. Well, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, remember, you can change the world 1 yard at a time.